June 15th, 1944, 3:17 a.m. Imperial Japanese Navy Intelligence Section, Rabaul, Papua New Guinea. Commander Tsunezo Wachi sat in the sweltering communications intercept room, his uniform soaked with perspiration that had nothing to do with the tropical heat. Before him lay 18 pages of intercepted American radio transmissions, meticulously transcribed by his radioman over the past 72 hours. The signals were clear, the reception excellent, every syllable captured with precision. Wachi had broken American, British, and Dutch codes throughout his 20-year career in naval intelligence. He had cracked the merchant marine cipher that allowed Japanese submarines to devastate Allied shipping in early 1942. He had decoded Australian military communications that revealed troop dispositions before the Battle of Coral Sea. He spoke fluent English, had studied at Cambridge before the war, and possessed what his superiors called an unnatural gift for finding patterns in chaos. But the papers before him might as well have been blank. The words, if they were words, bore no resemblance to any language in his extensive files. They weren't English corrupted by code. They weren't a substitution cipher or transposition system. They followed no mathematical pattern he could discern. The phonetic transcriptions his radioman had produced looked like gibberish. Walachi, Tsenil, Ake Diglini, Tinklaye. He had run every analytical technique in his arsenal. Frequency analysis revealed nothing. Positional pattern analysis found no repetition. Cross-referencing against known indigenous languages of the Pacific Tagalog, Chamorro, Hawaiian, Maori produced no matches. The transmissions were fast. Too, his radioman reported that the Americans sending these messages could communicate complex tactical information in a fraction of the time normal coded messages required. And the messages were clearly important. They preceded every major American operation, coordinated artillery strikes, directed troop movements, called in air support. Wachi pushed back from his desk and lit a cigarette with trembling hands. For the first time in his career, he felt the cold touch of professional defeat. He wasn't failing to break a code. He was failing to even identify what he was listening to. What Commander Wachi didn't know, as he stared at those incomprehensible transcriptions in the pre-dawn darkness, was that he wasn't fighting a code at all. He was confronting something far more insurmountable. An entire language, a linguistic system so complex and culturally embedded that no amount of cryptographic expertise could penetrate it. The Americans hadn't outthought the Japanese codebreakers. They had deployed a weapon the Japanese couldn't even recognize as a weapon, the Navajo language itself, transformed into a military communications system that would transmit thousands of critical messages throughout the Pacific War without a single one being deciphered. This wasn't a technological triumph or a mathematical innovation. It was the weaponization of cultural diversity, the transformation of a marginalized indigenous language into the most secure communications system in military history. The Japanese had built their intelligence apparatus around the assumption that all codes could be broken, given sufficient time, resources, and expertise. The Americans had deployed a communications system that wasn't a code in any traditional sense. It was a linguistic fortress built on grammar structures, tonal variations, and cultural knowledge that couldn't be acquired through cryptanalysis or captured documents. Commander Wachi was trying to solve an equation that had no solution, fighting an enemy that existed in a dimension his entire professional framework couldn't access, and he would never know why he failed. The scale of Japanese code-breaking success prior to encountering Navajo communications made their complete failure all the more shocking and inexplicable. Imperial Japanese intelligence services had achieved remarkable penetrations of Allied communications throughout the Pacific War. They had broken American merchant codes, allowing submarine commanders to position their vessels along predicted convoy routes with devastating effectiveness. In the first 6 months of 1942, Japanese codebreakers had achieved partial breaks of American tactical radio codes, providing advance warning of several Allied operations. They had successfully decrypted Dutch colonial communications in Indonesia, British signals in Burma and Malaya, and had even achieved limited success against some American military ciphers. The cryptographic section in Tokyo employed over 800 trained analysts, linguists, and mathematicians working around the clock to intercept and decode Allied messages. They had sophisticated frequency analysis equipment, extensive libraries of captured codebooks, and interrogation reports from prisoners that provided crucial insights into enemy communications procedures. Their success rate against conventional Allied codes was estimated at 10–15%, not complete penetration, but enough to provide tactically valuable intelligence. They understood codes. They had broken codes. They knew the patterns, the mathematical foundations, the linguistic structures that underlay encrypted communications. But against Navajo, their success rate was zero. Not low zero. Across 4 years of war, across thousands of intercepted transmissions, across hundreds of the best cryptographic minds Japan possessed, they achieved exactly nothing. No breaks, no partial solutions, no incremental progress. The Navajo transmissions remained as impenetrable on the last day of the war as they had been on the first. The Navajo language itself was a fortress built of linguistic complexity that defied every assumption of code-breaking methodology. Navajo is a tonal language. The same word spoken at different pitches means entirely different things. It is an agglutinative language, building complex concepts by stringing together morphemes in ways that create words of stunning length and specificity. A single Navajo word could convey what required an entire sentence in English. The language has no alphabet in the traditional sense, no direct one-to-one correspondence with English sounds. It contains sounds that don't exist in Japanese, English, or most other languages. Glottalized consonants, nasal vowels, tonal distinctions that native speakers learn from birth but outsiders struggle for years to master. The grammar structure is radically different from Indo-European languages. Verbs change form based on the shape and consistency of the object being discussed. The language distinguishes between animate and inanimate objects in ways that affect every sentence structure. There are multiple plural forms depending on whether you're discussing 2 things, 3 or more things, or an uncountable number. Linguists estimated that fewer than 30 non-Navajos in the entire world spoke the language fluently in 1942, and none of them were Japanese. The Japanese had no Navajo language materials, no dictionaries, no grammar texts, no prisoners who spoke the language, no way to even begin approaching the linguistic barrier before them. They were trying to decode a language that their entire analytical framework couldn't process, analyzing sounds their ears literally couldn't distinguish properly, looking for patterns in a linguistic system that operated on principles completely foreign to their experience. The operational deployment of Navajo Code Talkers began in 1942 and expanded systematically throughout the Pacific War, creating a communications network that moved from experimental to indispensable with remarkable speed. The first 29 Navajo recruits completed training at Camp Pendleton, California, in September 1942, having developed the initial code that would be refined and expanded throughout the war. By 1945, approximately 400 Navajo Code Talkers had been trained and deployed across the Pacific Theater, serving with Marine Corps divisions at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and dozens of smaller operations. Each Marine division eventually had its own Code Talker platoon, typically consisting of 15 to 20 Navajo Marines who operated in 2-man teams, transmitting and receiving messages during combat operations. The system worked with devastating efficiency, a 3-line English message that would take a trained cryptographer 30 minutes to encode, transmit, and decode, using contemporary military ciphers, could be transmitted in Navajo and decoded in 20 seconds. This wasn't a marginal improvement. It was an order of magnitude increase in communications speed that fundamentally altered battlefield command and control capabilities. American commanders could adjust tactics in real time, coordinate complex multi-unit operations with precision, call in artillery and air support with minimal delay, all because their communications network operated at speeds the Japanese couldn't match, even with their most efficient codes. The code itself, the system built on top of the Navajo language, added another layer of security that made an already impossible task completely insurmountable. The Code Talkers didn't simply speak Navajo over the radio, they used a code within the language. For military terms that had no Navajo equivalent, they created a vocabulary using Navajo words for animals, natural objects, and common items. An airplane became watadene bird. A battleship became lotso whale. A submarine became besh lo ironfish. A bomb became ayeshi eggs. But this was only the first level of encoding. For letters of the alphabet necessary for spelling out technical terms, place names, or proper nouns, they created multiple Navajo words for each letter. The letter A could be represented by wolachi, ant, bilasana, apple, or tsenil, axe. The letter B could be nahashchid, badger, shush, bear, or toish, jay, barrel. This multiple option system meant that even if a Japanese cryptographer somehow learned Navajo, even if they somehow obtained a vocabulary list, they still couldn't break the code, because the same letter could be represented by different words each time, eliminating pattern analysis. The code talkers would vary their encoding deliberately to prevent repetition patterns. Japanese cryptographers listening to these transmissions were confronting not just a foreign language, but a coded system within that language, implemented by speakers who could switch between coding schemes fluently and rapidly. They would need to break the language, break the code, and break the intentional variation system, and they couldn't even accomplish step one. The security record of the Navajo Code was absolute and unprecedented in the history of military cryptography. From its first operational use at Guadalcanal in late 1942 to the surrender of Japan in August 1945, not a single Navajo-coded message was deciphered by Japanese intelligence. This is not a claim, this is documented fact, confirmed by examination of captured Japanese intelligence archives after the war, and by the testimony of Japanese cryptographers interviewed by American military historians. The Japanese never achieved even a partial break, never identified the language being used, never made any progress whatsoever toward understanding the transmissions they were intercepting. For comparison, the famous German Enigma code, considered highly secure by German forces, was broken by Allied cryptographers at Bletchley Park, providing invaluable intelligence throughout the war. The Japanese naval code JN-25 was partially broken by American cryptographers, leading to the decisive American victory at Midway. Even American military codes achieved partial penetration by Japanese intelligence. But the Navajo Code stood alone, an island of perfect security, in a war where almost every other communication system was compromised to some degree. Cryptographic historians consider it the only code in modern military history that was never broken during its period of active use. The irony was profound. The most sophisticated code-breaking machinery and expertise of World War II computers, mathematical analysis, captured documents, prisoner interrogations could break machine-generated codes of extreme complexity, but couldn't penetrate a system based on human language and cultural knowledge. The volume of classified information transmitted via Navajo code during critical operations revealed just how much American commanders trusted the system's security. During the first 48 hours of the Battle of Iwo Jima in February 1945, Navajo Code Talkers transmitted over 800 messages without a single error, coordinating the most complex amphibious assault in Marine Corps history. These weren't routine status updates, they were target coordinates for naval bombardment, troop movement orders, casualty reports, intelligence assessments, ammunition resupply requests, and tactical adjustments. Information that, if intercepted and decoded, could have allowed Japanese defenders to anticipate American moves and concentrate their forces at critical points. The Americans transmitted this information in clear reliance on Navajo code security, with no backup encryption, no secondary codes, no hedging of bets. The 6 Navajo Code Talkers who raised the American flag on Mount Suribachi had just finished transmitting the message, "Mount Suribachi secured." They were combat Marines first, communications specialists second. At Okinawa, Code Talkers transmitted over 1,000 messages in the first 3 days of operations. American commanders were coordinating 5 divisions, multiple naval task forces, and hundreds of aircraft through a communications system that depended entirely on the linguistic barrier Navajo provided. If the Japanese had achieved even a partial break, the cost in American lives would have been catastrophic. But they didn't break it. They couldn't break it. The Americans could transmit their most sensitive operational information over radio frequencies they knew the Japanese were monitoring. confident that the messages were absolutely secure. The Japanese response to their failure followed a predictable progression, from confusion to desperation, to something approaching resignation. Early intelligence reports from 1942 to 43 referred to the mysterious transmissions as American Indian dialects, purpose unknown, indicating that Japanese analysts at least recognized the sounds weren't European languages. By 1944, the intelligence assessments showed increasing frustration, with reports noting that the enemy continues to employ an unidentifiable communication system that defeats all analytical attempts. Japanese commanders began pressuring their intelligence sections to produce results, any results, leading to some creative, but ultimately futile approaches. They attempted to capture Navajo Code Talkers alive, hoping interrogation might yield insights, but the Code Talkers were specifically trained to destroy their codebooks and materials if capture was imminent, and American forces assigned bodyguards to some Code Talkers with orders to prevent their capture at all costs. The Japanese tried technical approaches, deploying their most sensitive radio interception equipment, thinking perhaps the problem was signal clarity, but clearer reception of incomprehensible sounds remained incomprehensible. They tried linguistic analysis, bringing in every language expert they could find, playing recordings of intercepted transmissions, but none of their linguists had experience with any Native American language, let alone one as complex as Navajo. Some Japanese intelligence officers developed elaborate theories that the Americans were using some kind of machine encryption system disguised as voice communications, unable to accept that the barrier they faced was purely linguistic. The psychological impact on Japanese intelligence personnel was significant. These were professionals who had spent their careers successfully breaking codes, and their complete failure against Navajo was a form of professional destruction that undermined their confidence in their entire analytical framework. The contrast with the fate of other American communications security methods highlighted just how unique and valuable the Navajo Code was. The American M209 cipher machine, widely used for tactical communications, was partially compromised by German cryptographers, not fully broken, but vulnerable enough that American forces were advised not to use it for highly classified information. Various American military codes employed throughout the war achieved different levels of security, but all were considered potentially vulnerable to a sufficiently sophisticated cryptographic attack. The Americans assumed, correctly, that Japanese intelligence would intercept their radio communications and attempt to decode them, so they employed multiple layers of security, frequently changed codes, and limited the sensitivity of information transmitted by any single method. But with Navajo, they abandoned that caution entirely. They transmitted coordinates, unit designations, tactical plans, intelligence assessments, information that would have been painstakingly encrypted if sent via any other method. They did this because testing and operational experience had proven that Navajo was different. It wasn't just hard to break, it was impossible to break for an enemy who had no prior exposure to the language, no reference materials, no linguistic framework for even beginning the analysis. The Navajo Code Talkers became the preferred method for the most sensitive tactical communications because they were faster than encryption machines, more reliable than codebooks that could be captured, and absolutely secure against an enemy who couldn't tell where one word ended and the next began. The linguistic isolation of the Navajo language, the reason it proved so impenetrable, was itself a consequence of historical and geographical factors that had preserved the language from outside influence for centuries. Navajo is part of the Athabascan language family, linguistically related to languages spoken in Alaska and northwestern Canada, thousands of miles from the Navajo homeland in the American Southwest. This isolation meant the language developed along its own trajectory, without significant borrowing from Spanish, English, or other languages that Japanese linguists might have been familiar with. The Navajo people had resisted cultural assimilation more successfully than many other Native American groups, maintaining their language even in the face of government policies designed to suppress indigenous languages through boarding schools and forced assimilation programs. This resistance to cultural erasure, seen as a problem by American authorities for decades, became a military asset of incalculable value in 1942. The language that government officials had tried to eliminate became the language that protected American forces. The very obscurity that made Navajo useless in the eyes of assimilationists made it perfectly suited for military communications security. No Navajo language materials had been widely published. No foreign government had any strategic interest in the language. The Japanese, who had been preparing for war with America for years, who had studied American culture and military organization extensively, had no reason to learn or document an indigenous language spoken by fewer than 50,000 people in the American Southwest. Their intelligence preparation for war against America had failed to account for the possibility that America's cultural diversity would become a tactical weapon. The stories of individual code talkers revealed the human dimension of this strategic advantage. Men who transformed from marginalized members of American society into indispensable military assets almost overnight. Many code talkers had attended government boarding schools where speaking Navajo was forbidden, where children were punished for using their native language, where assimilation into white American culture was the explicit goal. Chester Nez, one of the original 29 code talkers, recalled being beaten for speaking Navajo at boarding school, then being recruited by the Marine Corps, specifically because of his fluency in the same language. The contradiction was profound but pragmatic. The American military needed what the American education system had tried to destroy. These men were trained as Marines first, excelling in the same brutal boot camp that broke many recruits. They could fight as infantry, handle weapons, navigate in combat, and survive in the harshest conditions. But their unique contribution was linguistic. They could think in Navajo, translate complex military concepts into the Navajo Code, transmit messages at conversational speed, and decode incoming messages with perfect accuracy under the stress of combat. Many code talkers served in multiple campaigns, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, transmitting messages while under enemy fire, maintaining perfect communications discipline, and preserving the security of the code even when wounded or under extreme duress. They were combat Marines who happened to possess a linguistic skill the Japanese couldn't counter, and their casualty rates reflected the dangerous nature of their work. Several code talkers were killed in action, others wounded, all of them targeted by Japanese forces, who didn't know what they were doing, but recognized that American radiomen were high-value targets. The creation of the code vocabulary represented a remarkable achievement in linguistic adaptation, taking a language that had developed without any military context and transforming it into a precision instrument for modern warfare. The original 29 code talkers spent weeks developing the vocabulary, debating the best Navajo words to represent military concepts, creating a system that was intuitive enough for rapid use, but complex enough to resist pattern analysis. They had to find Navajo equivalents for tanks, aircraft carriers, submarines, artillery pieces, military ranks, tactical formations, and hundreds of other concepts that had no counterpart in traditional Navajo life. Their solutions were often poetic and logical. A destroyer became Kalo, shark. A fighter plane became Dahitihi, hummingbird. A bomb became a Yeshi, eggs. A grenade became Nimasi, potatoes. The vocabulary eventually grew to over 600 terms, each carefully chosen to be distinctive, easy to remember, and resistant to confusion in the chaos of combat communications. The phonetic alphabet they developed with multiple Navajo words for each letter was genius in its complexity, eliminating the possibility of frequency analysis that might reveal patterns in coded transmissions. And critically, the code was never written down in any complete form that could be captured. Code talkers memorized the entire vocabulary, could recall any term instantly, and were trained to destroy their limited reference materials if capture appeared imminent. The Japanese would have needed to capture a code talker, convince him to cooperate despite intense loyalty training, extract the complete vocabulary from memory, and then still face the underlying Navajo language barrier. No wonder they failed. The speed advantage that Navajo communications provided translated into tactical flexibility that Japanese commanders couldn't match and often couldn't understand. Traditional military codes in World War II required messages to be written out, encoded using a codebook or encryption machine, transmitted using radio procedures that spelled out each encoded group, received by a radio operator, written down, and then decoded using the same codebook or machine before being delivered to the commander. The entire process might take 30 minutes to an hour for a complex tactical message, and that was if everything worked perfectly, if the codebooks were available, if the encryption machines functioned properly, if radio conditions were good. Navajo Code Talkers eliminated almost all of that delay. A commander could speak in English to the code talker, who would mentally convert the message to the Navajo code, transmit it at conversational speed, and the receiving code talker would mentally decode it and speak the English version to his commander. The entire process took seconds. This meant American units could respond to changing battlefield conditions with unprecedented speed. Artillery fire could be adjusted in real time, based on forward observer reports. Infantry units could coordinate flanking maneuvers while the enemy was still repositioning. Air support could be redirected to new targets with minimal delay. The Japanese, using slower encoding methods, found themselves consistently outpaced by American decision-making cycles. By the time they had encoded, transmitted, received, and decoded a status report, American forces had already adapted to the situation and moved on to the next tactical problem. The faster your communications, the faster you can make decisions. And the faster you can make decisions, the more you control the tempo of combat. The code talkers gave American forces a persistent tempo advantage that compounded over time into systematic tactical superiority. The intelligence disaster that the Navajo Code represented for Japan went beyond mere tactical communications security into the realm of strategic intelligence failure. Japanese intelligence services operated with the assumption, reasonable and supported by historical experience, that eventually, given time and resources, any code could be broken or at least partially compromised. This assumption shaped their operational planning, their intelligence collection priorities, and their resource allocation. They invested heavily in radio interception capabilities, deployed thousands of personnel to signals, intelligence roles, and maintained extensive cryptographic analysis sections at every major headquarters. But all of that investment proved worthless against Navajo communications. The thousands of man-hours spent attempting to decode Navajo messages produced zero intelligence value. The elaborate interception networks captured transmissions that were analytically useless. The top cryptographers pulled from other duties to work on the American Indian problem made no progress whatsoever. The resources devoted to breaking Navajo were resources not available for other intelligence priorities, and the opportunity cost was significant. Meanwhile, American signals intelligence was making steady progress against Japanese codes, reading portions of their naval communications, gaining insights into their deployments and intentions. The intelligence balance was systematically favoring the Americans, and the Navajo Code was a significant factor in that imbalance. The Japanese couldn't read American tactical communications, but the Americans could read at least portions of Japanese communications, an asymmetry that provided the Americans with consistent intelligence advantages throughout the Pacific War. The broader cultural implications of the Navajo Code Talkers' success revealed something profound about the nature of American military strength that extended beyond mere industrial capacity. The United States in 1942 was a diverse nation, far more diverse than Japan, with immigrants, indigenous peoples, and ethnic groups speaking dozens of languages and bringing different cultural perspectives. American military leaders, rather than seeing this diversity as a weakness or something to be suppressed, found ways to weaponize it. Navajo Code Talkers were the most successful example, but the military also employed Japanese-American soldiers as translators and intelligence specialists in the Pacific, Filipino scouts who knew the terrain and language of the Philippines, Chinese-American liaison officers who worked with Chinese forces, and German-speaking soldiers for intelligence work in Europe. This was a fundamentally different approach than the homogeneous Japanese military, which viewed cultural purity as a strength and diversity as a potential security risk. The Americans were systematically more creative in identifying and exploiting asymmetric advantages because their diverse population provided resources and capabilities that more homogeneous nations couldn't match. The Japanese never considered that American indigenous languages might be used for military communications. It was outside their conceptual framework. They assumed American military communications would use English, codes, or machine encryption, because that's what a modern military power would use. The possibility that the Americans would deploy a pre-technological solution, human language diversity, to defeat sophisticated technological cryptanalysis never occurred to them. It was a blind spot created by their own cultural assumptions about what constituted modern military capability. The physical and psychological stress code talkers endured went far beyond the normal challenges of combat communications. They were operating under conditions that would have challenged any soldier: tropical heat, jungle warfare, limited sleep, constant danger, while performing a task that required absolute mental precision. A single mistranslation could result in friendly fire, misdirected supplies, or tactical confusion that cost lives. The pressure was immense. Code talkers couldn't allow fatigue, stress, fear, or the chaos of combat to interfere with their linguistic accuracy. They had to maintain perfect concentration while under artillery bombardment, while Japanese snipers were targeting radiomen, while carrying 80-pound radio sets through jungle or volcanic ash, while dealing with radio equipment that was temperamental and frequently damaged by water, humidity, or enemy fire. Many code talkers transmitted messages for 48 hours straight during the initial phases of major operations, grabbing brief moments of sleep when communications traffic permitted, then returning to their posts. They dealt with the additional burden of knowing they were special targets. Japanese forces quickly learned that destroying American radio communications disrupted American operations, and radio men with their distinctive antennas were priority targets for snipers and artillery. Some code talkers were assigned bodyguards, other Marines whose specific job was to protect them from capture or death, which provided some protection but also emphasized how valuable and vulnerable they were. The psychological toll of being simultaneously essential and endangered, of knowing that your capture could compromise the entire communications system, created stress levels that would have broken many soldiers. But the code talkers persisted, transmitted their messages, maintained their security, and saved countless American lives through their linguistic precision under the most adverse conditions imaginable. The technological sophistication of Japanese cryptographic efforts made their failure against Navajo all the more remarkable and frustrating. Japanese intelligence services weren't primitive or unsophisticated. They had access to advanced radio interception equipment, frequency analysis tools, linguistic experts, and mathematical cryptographers who understood the principles of code breaking at the highest levels. They had successfully broken multiple Allied codes, demonstrating their technical competence. They had captured American codebooks early in the war, interrogated prisoners about communications procedures, and built an intelligence apparatus that was professional and capable. Against most American communication systems, they achieved at least limited success, enough to provide tactically valuable intelligence to field commanders. But against Navajo, all their sophistication was irrelevant. The problem wasn't technological, it was linguistic and cultural. They could intercept the signals perfectly. They could record them, analyze them, subject them to every test and technique in their arsenal. But they couldn't understand them because understanding required linguistic knowledge they didn't possess and couldn't acquire. It was analogous to a chess grandmaster facing an opponent who was playing a completely different game, say, go on the same board. All the chess expertise in the world wouldn't help, because the fundamental rules and structures were different. Japanese cryptographers were playing cryptographic chess. The code talkers were playing linguistic Go, and the Japanese didn't even realize they were playing different games. The post-war revelations about the Navajo Code's absolute security came as a shock to military historians and cryptographic experts who had assumed that eventually evidence would emerge of at least partial Japanese penetration. The systematic examination of captured Japanese intelligence archives, conducted by American occupation forces in 1945–46, found no evidence of any progress against Navajo communications. Japanese cryptographers interviewed about their wartime activities uniformly described their failure with Navajo in terms of profound frustration and professional humiliation. These were men who took pride in their analytical abilities, who had succeeded against other difficult problems, and their complete failure against Navajo had been deeply demoralizing. One Japanese cryptographer, interviewed by American intelligence officers in 1946, described the Navajo transmissions as the sounds of ghosts, something they could hear but never understand, communications that seemed to mock their expertise with their imperviousness to analysis. The Americans, for their part, had maintained the Navajo Code security classification after the war ended, partly because they considered using the same system in future conflicts. The code talkers themselves were sworn to secrecy, forbidden to discuss their wartime service even with family members. It wasn't until 1968, 23 years after the war ended, that the Navajo Code was declassified, and the code talkers' contribution could be publicly acknowledged. The revelation that American indigenous people had created an unbreakable military code using their native language became one of the most celebrated and surprising stories of World War II, a counterpoint to narratives that focused exclusively on technology and industrial capacity as the sources of Allied victory. The actual words and sounds that so confounded Japanese cryptographers represented a linguistic system that exists in only about 1% of the world's languages, a level of complexity that makes it exceptionally difficult for adult learners to acquire fluency. Navajo phonology includes 33 consonants and 12 vowels, many of which have no equivalents in Indo-European languages. The glottalized consonant sounds produced by simultaneous closure of the glottis are particularly difficult for non-native speakers to distinguish or produce. The nasal vowels, which sound similar to oral vowels to untrained ears, change word meanings entirely. The tonal system, where pitch variations carry semantic weight, adds another layer of complexity that makes the language essentially opaque to listeners whose native languages don't use tone. Japanese, while it has pitch accent, doesn't use tone in the same way Navajo does, creating a perceptual barrier that would have made it difficult for Japanese linguists to even accurately transcribe the sounds they were hearing. The verb system in Navajo is notoriously complex, with verbs changing form based on aspect, mode, subject, and the physical characteristics of objects involved in the action. A verb describing the action of picking up an object has different forms depending on whether the object is round, flat, flexible, contained, animate, or countless other categories. This complexity isn't a bug, it's a feature that makes the language capable of expressing subtle distinctions with remarkable precision. But for an outsider trying to learn the language from scratch, with no reference materials and no native speakers to guide them, the complexity is overwhelming. Even professional linguists with years of training find Navajo challenging. Japanese intelligence officers attempting to decode it during a war, with no linguistic foundation and no time for years of study, had no chance. The Battle of Iwo Jima provided perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of code talker capabilities under the most extreme combat conditions. The initial assault on February 19, 1945 involved 70,000 American Marines attacking a heavily fortified island defended by 22,000 Japanese troops who had spent months preparing elaborate defensive positions. The complexity of coordinating such a massive operation, multiple division-level units, naval gunfire support, close air support, logistics networks, medical evacuation required communication systems that were fast, reliable, and secure. The 6 Navajo Code Talkers attached to the assault forces transmitted over 800 messages in the first 48 hours, including the critical initial beachhead situation reports, requests for naval gunfire on specific Japanese positions, coordination of reserve deployments, and medical evacuation requests. Japanese commanders on Iwo Jima could hear these transmissions. Their radio interception equipment was functioning, and the Americans weren't even attempting to hide their communications. But the Japanese couldn't understand what they were hearing, couldn't anticipate American movements based on the intercepted communications, couldn't exploit the intelligence windfall that radio interception normally provided. American commanders on Iwo Jima operated with the confidence that their tactical communications were secure, allowing them to coordinate complex maneuvers without fear of compromise. The battle was extraordinarily costly, nearly 7,000 American dead, 20,000 wounded. But the American victory was never in doubt once the beachhead was established, largely because American forces could coordinate their superior firepower with precision timing that Japanese defenders couldn't counter. The Code Talkers weren't winning the battle directly, but they were enabling the coordination that made American victory possible. Japanese defenders fought with extraordinary courage and tactical skill, but they were fighting blind in a critical sense, unable to read American intentions, unable to predict the next attack, forced to react rather than anticipate. The contrast between the Code Talkers' public invisibility during the war and their critical importance to military operations revealed something about the nature of asymmetric advantages in warfare. The P-38 Lightning was a visible symbol of American air power. Enemy pilots saw it, feared it, and Japanese intelligence could measure and analyze its capabilities. The massive American industrial production was visible in the ships, aircraft, tanks, and supplies that arrived in the Pacific in overwhelming quantities. But the Navajo Code Talkers operated in the shadows, unknown to the public, unmentioned in press coverage due to security restrictions, invisible to the enemy, except as anonymous radiomen, transmitting incomprehensible sounds. Their contribution couldn't be measured in tonnage produced or enemies killed. It was measured in messages delivered, time saved, intelligence denied to the enemy, and operations successfully coordinated. These are metrics that don't make dramatic photographs or news headlines, but they were just as critical to American victory as the more visible elements of military power. The Japanese never knew what weapon they were facing, never identified the source of their communications security failure, never understood that their inability to break American codes was due to something as simple and profound as human language diversity. They kept searching for a technological solution to what was fundamentally a cultural problem, kept assuming the barrier would eventually yield to sufficient analysis, and died never knowing that the sounds that defeated them were the words of a people whose language the American government had once tried to erase. The final testament to the Navajo Code's value came from Major Howard Connor, the signal officer for the 5th Marine Division at Iwo Jima, who stated after the battle, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." This wasn't hyperbole or public relations, it was the professional assessment of an officer who understood how critical, secure, fast communications had been to the operation's success. Connor had watched the Code Talkers work under fire, had seen how quickly they could transmit complex tactical information, and had observed how American forces could operate with a level of coordination that Japanese forces couldn't match. The statement resonated through military communications circles because it acknowledged something that had been obvious to those who worked with Code Talkers but wasn't widely understood. Linguistic security wasn't just a nice-to-have capability, it was a war-winning advantage. The Marines would have attempted to take Iwo Jima, with or without Code Talkers, but the operation would have been slower, costlier, and possibly unsuccessful if American forces had been forced to use slower, less secure communications methods. The Japanese ability to intercept and potentially decode conventional communications would have provided them with intelligence advantages that could have helped them more effectively concentrate their forces and disrupt American operations. The Code Talkers denied them that advantage entirely, contributing to an American victory that was costly but decisive. Commander Tsunezo Wachi never learned what defeated him. He survived the war, returned to Japan, and lived until 1968, the same year the Navajo Code was declassified. If he ever learned that the transmissions that had haunted him throughout the Pacific War was simply an indigenous American language being spoken clearly and openly, with no sophisticated encryption beyond vocabulary substitution, one wonders what his reaction would have been. His failure wasn't personal, no Japanese cryptographer succeeded where he failed. It was systemic, a collision between Japanese intelligence capabilities and a communications system that existed outside the framework of what they understood as possible. He had been trained to break codes, to find patterns in noise, to apply mathematical and linguistic analysis to encrypted messages. He was never trained for the possibility that the code might be no code at all, but rather a language so obscure and complex that it functioned as perfect encryption without any encryption taking place. In his memoirs, published in Japanese in 1962, Wachi devoted several pages to what he called the ghost transmissions, describing his frustration and the institutional embarrassment of never solving what became known within Japanese intelligence circles as unsolvable problem. He never learned it was Navajo. He died believing it was some kind of sophisticated American machine encryption that he simply lacked the resources or time to break. The truth that it was human language, spoken by indigenous people whose culture the modern world had tried to marginalize, would have seemed impossible to him. And perhaps that's the final victory of the Code Talkers. They defeated an enemy who never understood what they were fighting. In the end, the story of the Navajo Code Talkers is not primarily a story about cryptography or technology. It is a story about what happens when cultural diversity becomes a military asset, when the marginalized become indispensable, when the solution to a modern problem comes from an ancient source. The Japanese had built their entire intelligence apparatus around the assumption that modern warfare required modern solutions, technology, mathematics, sophisticated analysis. The Americans demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful weapon is something that can't be mass-produced or mathematically analyzed, something that exists in the minds and cultures of people whose very existence represents a different way of seeing the world. The Navajo language survived centuries of pressure to assimilate, to modernize, to disappear into the dominant culture. It survived because the Navajo people preserved it, taught it to their children, maintained it against forces that saw it as obsolete and worthless. And then, when needed, that language became a weapon that the most sophisticated enemy cryptographers in the world couldn't defeat. Not because it was technologically advanced, but because it was culturally specific, linguistically complex, and unknown to anyone outside a small community in the American Southwest. The lesson extends far beyond World War II communications. Diversity isn't just a moral imperative or a social good. It's a strategic asset that provides capabilities and options that homogeneous systems can't match. The Japanese lost the war for many reasons: industrial capacity, resource limitations, strategic overextension. But they also lost because they couldn't imagine that the solution to American communications security would come from the people and languages that modern industrial society had tried to erase. The Navajo Code Talkers proved that sometimes the future belongs to those who preserve the past, that strength comes in forms that can't be quantified or manufactured, and that the most unbreakable code in the world was hidden in plain sight, spoken openly over the radio, waiting for someone to understand it. The Japanese never did.